Parliamentary Updates. Magna Carta, one of the most important documents in the history of democracy, yet many citizens do not know what Magna Carta is, more so its significance to our country's constitution. Issued by the barons of King John, the King of England, on June 15, 1215, the document was created to limit the powers of the king and protect the rights of the people. Although in practice Magna Carta could not limit the powers of an absolute king, its very existence signified authority over the supreme ruler. The series of documents or charters which constitute Magna Carta has been reconfirmed many times between the 13th and 15th centuries. However, most of its core concepts such as democracy and equality have remained permanent. In fact, Magna Carta has influenced many countries' constitutional documents, including that of the United States and several Commonwealth nations. In an effort to foster awareness among the Caribbean countries within the Commonwealth, the University of the West Indies Constitutional Affairs and Parliamentary Studies Unit was awarded a research grant to launch a series of seminars and lectures leading up to the 800th anniversary of the sealing of Magna Carta on June 15, 2015. According to Dr. Hamid Ghani, coordinator of the Constitutional Affairs and Parliamentary Studies Unit at UWI, and whose proposal aided in the successful award of the grant to the unit, the objectives of the grant are to serve as a Commonwealth Caribbean link to the Magna Carta 800th Anniversary Committee, to provide a platform throughout the Commonwealth Caribbean leading up to the 800th anniversary, and to raise the level of awareness throughout the Commonwealth Caribbean of the significance of Magna Carta in the context of democracy and human rights. As a result, Chairman of Magna Carta 800th Anniversary Committee, Sir Robert Worchester, a celebrated political and economic contributor and founder of MORI, Market and Opinion Research International Limited, delivered a distinguished lecture in which he spoke about his admiration for Magna Carta and involvement in the Magna Carta 800th Anniversary Committee.
I'm going to cover three things in my talk this evening. Why me? Why now? Why here? Why are you here on such a lovely autumn evening? And why commemorate Magna Carta at all? Why me? Growing up in America, as I did, I had a pretty thorough schooling in English history, English literature, and not least English cinema. That was, believe it or not, before television. It began with the Angles, the Saxons, and Jutes, and then 1066 and all that, and 1215, the Great Charter, later Magna Carta. From an early age, it was good King Richard and bad King John. Sir King Richard, the Lionheart, King John, Lackland. And Robin Hood and his merry men, and Maid Marian, Little John, Friar Tuck, Will Scarlet, and all. Then King Henry VIII, Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, Shakespeare, 18th century dress, architecture, Georgian elegance in costume, architecture, and music. I could hardly understand as a boy how the American colonies could possibly have separated from England, the land of my forefathers, especially when all Americans knew then that George Washington, John Adams, John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, and nearly all the founding fathers were Englishmen. Alexander Hamilton, of course, was a Scot, but he was born in the Caribbean. Growing up during the Second World War gave me a grasp of geography, as did stamp collecting and of history, and the legacy I had of England's last stand in Europe, of stopping the relentless march of the German armies of occupation, and the role that America and Britain's allies, and especially Britain's colonies, had on saving our mutually shared way of life, of democracy, of human rights, and of the rule of law. I grew up with the belief that the sun never sets on the British Empire, and certainly that included, in my mind as a boy, the Caribbean, because I collected stamps from all over the British Empire, and I still have that stamp book. and in it there are stamps from names that are like magic to me: Barbados, Jamaica, Dominica, Haiti, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the rest. I even memorized all the Caribbean flags as a boy and spent hours closely examining my globe and maps and later devouring the annually updated World Almanac. As a boy, I dreamed about Grenada and the Grenadines, the Spice Islands, Antigua, Trinidad and Tobago, British Guiana, when the rarest stamp in the world would cost just $50,000. Now it's worth many millions. The Spanish Main were where the sea battles I read about most were fought. I hoped someday to visit those countries, which then to me were the most interesting and the most exotic of the British Empire. But I never dreamed I'd actually live in the Caribbean. Who, me? Live outside Middle America? Unlikely. New York, possibly. Even maybe London someday. But the Caribbean? That was the land of dreams, not reality. I didn't take a Caribbean holiday for some years after moving to London in 1969, as I first explored Britain, Ireland, France, and other European countries, and even St. Petersburg, as it was called, Leningrad then East Africa, and finally, years later, to Antigua. The weather in Antigua was as promised, but I found it flat, uninteresting, with just a tinge among younger Antiguans of hostility toward us, with no sign of this among their older generations, lovely people, as I discovered when I habitually picked up walkers as I drove back and forth across the countryside. My wife and I decided Antigua, not for us. And then fate struck again in London as I met a fellow enthusiast for your islands, who found himself also by fate in the Grenadines. He convinced me to visit there. And one thing led to another. We bought property where he had. We built our home, was encouraged by SVG's Prime Minister's son, Mitchell, to become resident in St. Vincent, and finally by Comrade Ralph Gonzalez to become citizens, and are now planning even more time there in the future as we contemplate retirement. So where does the Magna Carta enter into all this reflection? The first time I ventured out of Middle America was when I was 6. My parents took me to the New York World's Fair. There are 3 things I vividly remember from that visit. It was an exciting holiday. The most amazing giant sculpture of the world globe, which still remains on the site nearly 75 years later. The smorgasbord at the Danish exhibition, when there was more food spread out than I'd ever seen before. My eyes were bigger than my stomach. And not least, certainly not least, the British exhibition, where I saw for the first time a Magna Carta. On my first visit to Britain in 1957, I was a serving officer in the American Army, returning from Korea to be discharged. After serving there, my tour of duty completed. The first day, the first morning in London in my life, I went to the British Museum to see 2 things: the Magna Carta and the Rosetta Stone. For to me, those were the icons of a civilized society, the rule of law and communication outside the village. I became a trustee of the Magna Carta Trust 21 years ago when I became chairman of the Pilgrim Society. The chairman of the trust, by charter, is the master of the rolls, the head of civil law in England. On one's last day before promotion to the UK's Supreme Court in 2010, I was asked to come to meet his successor, now the president of the Supreme Court, and they together told me that they'd decided that I should lead the 800th anniversary commemoration committee worldwide. And that was a Wednesday. And on the Friday, there was a meeting of the trust, and the United States was there, represented by the president and the treasurer of the American Bar Association, Australia, very distinguished. Air Chief Marshal David Evans, the chairman of the Australian Magna Carta Committee, were present. And the new Master of the Rolls, chairman of the trust, in the chair announced that I was taking over the world. I thought I'd only signed up for the British Committee. And I said, and then I thought, in for a penny, in for a pound. So how could I refuse? President Obama observed in 2011, in a speech to the British Parliament, our system of justice, customs, and values stem from our British forefathers. Centuries ago, when kings, emperors, and warlords reigned over much of the world, it was the English who first spelled out the rights and liberties of man in Magna Carta. So that's why I'm here, and why now, and as a CARICOM citizen, why I'm in the Caribbean today. So why are you here this evening? You believe in freedom. When I mention Magna Carta to people who believe in freedom everywhere in the world, democratic countries or not, eyes light up. You believe in democracy. In a survey we carried out in 2006 in Trinidad and Tobago, we measured public opinion as part of the 50-plus country World Values Survey. We found that close to 9 in 10, 86% of Trinis and Tobagoans believe that it is, quote, it is important to live in a democratic society, and nearly 2 Trinidadians and Tobagoans in 3, said that they would actually fight for their country if the democratic way of life was threatened. The question we asked was this: of course, we all hope that Trinidad and Tobago would not be involved in another war. But if it were to come to that, would you be willing to fight for your country? In 2010, the most recent survey in that series, 64%, nearly 2/3, said they were willing. No change at all from 2006, 4 years earlier, when the same finding was the result of our survey. And Trinidad, at 64%, was a bit above the international average of 54 countries of 60%. You believe in the rule of law. Magna Carta enshrined the rule of law. It limited the power of authoritarian rule, as was mentioned before. It paved the way for trial by jury, modified through the ages as the franchise was extended. You believe in human rights. It's taken 8 centuries to get to where there is in these islands every adult without any barriers whatsoever, not of ownership of property, not of the statue in society, not gender, not race, color, or nearly anything else, and I'll come back to that in a moment. You enjoy the right to vote in open elections for your country's leaders, universal suffrage. I'd like to test your knowledge of Magna Carta. You wouldn't, I'd guess, being in this audience of mainly scholars, jurists, lawyers, other interested parties. You're aware of what the Magna Carta is, but just to check, how many of you, if any, in this room and viewing around the Caribbean who will be watching this streaming broadcast have heard of Magna Carta before being enlisted in this lecture? Could I have any hands up? You've all heard of it. Anybody who hadn't before. So what percentage of young people in your country would you say are aware of Magna Carta? 80%? Anybody? Above 80? Above 70? Above 60? Above 50? I see a lot of heads shaking. Above 40? Not a single hands up. Further down, sir. Above 30? Above 20? Yeah, I see a few hands coming up. Above 10? Is that the consensus? Above 10? No? All right, hands up. Above 10. Hands down. 10 or below? The minority has it. It's 10. Sorry, I tricked you into that. of the people who will be viewing this, count that in your groups and send in your counts to Dr. Ganny, to my friend Dr. Hammond. And how many are total in the room so we can see what other countries in the Caribbean who are watching this today, this evening, say. I'll make a rough guess that it'll be 20% across the board in the participants here and elsewhere, as we've proved it is here, and less than 10% of the young folks. Well, I can tell you what it is among the general public in Trinidad and Tobago, of just 1 in 10, as I say, and 7 in 100 young people have ever heard of Magna Carta, compared with 1/3 who've heard of the King James Bible. No, sorry, 2/3 who have heard of the King James Bible. 1/3 have heard of Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. UK Declaration of Independence, 1/4. The Case for West Indian Self-Government by C.L.R. James, 1 in 5. And by the way, my elder son wrote a biography published some years ago on C.L.R. James and spent a good bit of time in your country doing so. The Doomsday Book, 12%. Magna Carta, as I've said, 10% of all and 7% of young people. When we ask which of those who had heard of it, which of these rights do you think the Magna Carta guaranteed? The highest was 20% who said democracy. 7% was next highest, basic human rights from arbitrary arrest. Freedom of religion, 5. Freedom of speech, 4. Equal rights for women, 3. They were certainly optimists, weren't they? I'm afraid it didn't happen in 1215. So there are many myths which surround the Magna Carta. It was only about a fight between the barons and the king, and it was really just a peace treaty. Well, it was certainly that, but that certainly wasn't the only. It was the beginning of the spread of modern democracy, as we've heard. It was the overturning for the first time, peacefully, of divine rule. King John did keep his head. Somewhat later, King George III's power over the American colonists was tested. The beginning of representative democracy, and as Lord Judge, Igor Judge, the former Lord Chief Justice of the United Kingdom, recently said, nullum scuta genum, bel auxilium pontitur in regio nostro, nisi per commune concilium regi nostri. Or as the British would say, no scutage or aid shall be imposed on our kingdom unless by the common consent of our kingdom, which very roughly translated into American means no taxation without representation. And every American school child knows that phrase. It's drummed into them in their classrooms from an early age. But did you know that Americans abroad were the last to be disenfranchised? And that included me. I was disenfranchised. I'd lost the right to vote in American elections when I moved to London. Well, what did we do about it? We organized, because that's what Americans do. We formed a protest group in 1972. I moved there in 1969. We called our group Tax Equity for Americans Abroad, TEAA, the second Tea Party in American history. Our theme, give us the vote or we stop paying taxes. Your choice, we thought, thinking it would be easy. It wasn't. It took 4 years to get a mover and shaker in American politics to listen. At the Carter Convention in New York City in 1976, we got 5 minutes with the most powerful person in Congress, Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House of Representatives, third in line to the presidency. We gave him our proposal, the vote or no tax. You don't have the vote, he said? Well, that's outrageous. I replied for our group. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I responded, pulling a tea bag out of my pocket. And if you don't give us the vote, we'll come and dump tea in your harbor. He was, you may remember, the congressman for Cambridge next to Boston, and right on the Boston harbor where the colonial rebels, dressed as Indians, dumped the British tea into the harbor. We'll have to do something about that, he said, and he did. And when? Remember, that was the summer of '76. On the 7th of January, '77, President Ford signed, not sealed, the Overseas Citizens Voting Rights Act. Magna Carta was the foundation of human rights. They're in threat now at home and abroad as we consider how to cope with the threats of the 21st century. It proclaimed religious liberty. When asked all religion should be taught in our public schools, 9 in 10 Trinis and Tobagoans agreed. And 4 in 5, 80%, rejected the notion that the only acceptable religion is my religion. Magna Carta is England's greatest export. It now affects the lives of nearly 2 billion people in over 100 countries throughout the world. For centuries, it's influenced constitutional thinking worldwide, including in many Commonwealth countries, even in France, Germany, and Japan, and throughout Asia, Latin America, Africa, and of course the Caribbean. Over the past 800 years, denials of Magna Carta's basic principles have led to a loss of liberties, of human rights, even genocide, taking place yesterday, today, and I'm sadly have to say tomorrow. This is an exceptional document on which all democratic society has been constructed. Described to me by the former German ambassador in London when he said to me, "Everybody in Germany knows the Magna Carta. It's the foundation of democracy." I was a little startled to hear that. And months later, the Japanese ambassador to Britain and his wife were spending the weekend with us. And at breakfast, I brought this up, and they said the same thing. Several years ago, I approached the private secretary to Queen Elizabeth to ask her to be patron of the Magna Carta Trust and of the Magna Carta 800th Committee's anniversary commemoration, to be at Runnymede on the 15th of June, on the anniversary day. Be involved in other ways, and the answers when he returned from Balmoral, when she'd been consulted, were all positive. But one thing, he added, Her Majesty said, to tell me, do not forget the Commonwealth. That, of course, is another reason why I'm here today. One of the many activities planned is to have the UK Supreme Court organized mock trial with judges, jury, and advocates, mainly from Commonwealth countries, possibly one of those advocates from Trinidad, judging barons and bishops in the dock on the charge of treason, telecast and broadcast on BBC World and hopefully PBS in the States, but available all over the world. This will be on the 31st of July, the night before the Supreme Court's Magna Carta exhibition opens for August and September next year. The British Library, starting in February, will have the biggest exhibition it's ever held. The exhibition at the Library of Congress in Washington begins on the 6th of November with the Princess Royal as the guest of honor. There will be exhibitions and demonstrations, pageants and concerts, sound and light shows, seminar and symposium, commemorative coins and suites of stamps in Commonwealth countries, pop rock and religious anthems, a 60-minute cantata and a calypso song, hopefully, from specially composed for the 800th by a noted Trinidadian composer of calypso. Open lectures and plays in the Magna Carta towns, in cathedrals and castles, town halls and town squares throughout the land in England and elsewhere, and many exhibitions and events in Canada and the US, France, Germany, Poland, here in Trinidad, thanks to Hamid, and throughout the Eastern Caribbean, in Southern Asia, Southern Africa, Australia and New Zealand, and everywhere the values and principles the barons wrenched from bad King John at Runnymede. They had to fight for it and were the beneficiaries of their fight. Our esteemed academic colleague, Nicholas Vincent, was asked by the Telegraph in an article, in an interview a year ago, February, did King John really deserve to be called bad King John? And he said no, he was much worse than that. You can follow the commemoration of the 800th by signing up to the Magna Carta newsletter at our website and tell us you too would like to get involved. It's www.magnacarta.org. one word, Magna Carta 800th, magnacarta800th.com. And I hope some of you will be with us next year on the 800th anniversary at Runnymede with the Queen, and some as well in Westminster Hall for the mock trial at the end of July, or at least watching it on BBC World. And I hope PBS in the United States, ABC in Australia, Canada on CBC, and here on your local channels. This particular lecture and the preceding entertainment and introduction remarks will be on the Parliament channel. Finally, my thanks to my two Trinidad-based movers and shakers, Dr. Hamid Ghani, our chairman for this evening, who's organized the 11-country symposium series and the open lectures across the Caribbean, many listening this evening, and our philatelic advisor, Mr. Albert Sidney, who is responsible for the designs of sets of stamps which we hope will be accepted by the CARICOM countries' prime ministers and presidents and issued during 2015. There's lots that could be happening in the Commonwealth, and you can take pride that the Caribbean is in the lead of the Commonwealth, not lagging, and that's thanks particularly to Dr. Ghani. Thank you for listening.
Magna Carta is often viewed as a foundation of democracy. Its existence and eventual 800th anniversary celebration in June 2015 can serve as a reminder to those in authority that no one is above the law. Parliamentary updates.